The knock on Walt Bracken's door came at 7 in the morning, hard enough to rattle the glass. He set his coffee down slow, the way he did everything since his wife passed. Through the window he saw the cruiser in his driveway, lights off, engine still running. Behind it, a woman in a beige blazer stood with a clipboard pressed to her chest like a shield. Walt opened the door before they could knock again. "Mr. Bracken," the deputy asked. "That's right." The woman stepped forward. "I'm Carol Vance, president of the Meadow Creek Homeowners Association. You've received 3 notices about your fence line encroaching on common property. You haven't responded to any of them." Walt looked at her, then at the deputy, then back at her. "Ma'am, I'm not a member of your association." Carol's mouth tightened. "Everyone in Meadow Creek is a member. It's not optional." "I didn't buy a house in Meadow Creek," Walt said. "I bought the land under it." For a moment nobody said anything. The wind moved through the dry grass behind him, and somewhere down the road a dog started barking at nothing. "That doesn't make any sense," Carol said. Walt almost smiled. "It will." The deputy shifted his weight. "Sir, we just need you to sign the notice acknowledging." "I'm not signing anything," Walt said quietly. "And I'd ask you both to get off my property." Carol's face went the color of old brick. "This is HOA governed land, Mr. Bracken. You don't get to just decide you're not part of it." Walt held her eyes a long moment. "Ma'am, you might want to sit down before you find out how wrong you are." Carol did not sit down. She stood there with her clipboard, waiting for him to back down the way most people did. Walt didn't explain anything. He just nodded to the deputy, said, "Have a good morning, officer," and closed the door. Inside, Walt sat back down at his kitchen table. The coffee had gone lukewarm. He didn't mind. He'd had worse mornings. 3 years ago, this had all been Delacroix land, 600 acres of scrub and cattle range, belonging to a developer named Roy Delacroix, a man who'd made a fortune turning ranchland into subdivisions. He'd carved half of it into Meadow Creek, 40 homes and a clubhouse nobody used, and left the rest sitting empty, waiting on financing that never came. When Roy's company went under 2 winters back, the whole parcel, homes, common areas, roads, the empty back acreage, got folded into a single bankruptcy estate. Walt had spent 30 years running cattle and reading contracts nobody else wanted to read, and he understood exactly what it meant when a developer bundled a subdivision's infrastructure into the same deed as the raw land around it. It meant somebody, someday, was going to own all of it. Roads, common areas, the ground the clubhouse sat on. Walt had been that somebody for 14 months now. He hadn't told anyone. His wife used to say he kept things close the way other men kept guns, loaded, quiet, brought out only when they mattered. This mattered now. 2 days later, Walt got a certified letter demanding he remove his fence from shared common land within 30 days or face a lien. He read it twice, then called his own lawyer, not to fight, but to confirm what he already knew. "You're sure the deed transfer included the clubhouse parcel and the internal roads, all of it?" The lawyer said, "You don't just own land near the HOA. You own the land the HOA sits on. They can't lien something they don't have legal standing over. Send them something," Walt said. Not angry, just true. Carol found the second letter in her mailbox Thursday and read it standing in her driveway. By the 3rd paragraph, her hands had gone still. It stated plainly that Walt and Bracken held title to the parcels in question, including the clubhouse lot, the roadway easements, and the retention area the HOA had been maintaining. That evening, she called an emergency board meeting. "This has to be a mistake," the treasurer said. "You can't just buy an HOA." "He didn't buy the HOA," Carol said. "He bought the ground it's sitting on." Frank Delray, a retired contractor who'd lived there longest, said quietly, "I remember when this was Bracken land before Delacroix ever touched it. Should have known it'd find its way back." He shook his head. "Man like that doesn't do things out of spite, Carol. If he's making a point, somebody gave him a reason to." Carol thought of her own voice on that porch, telling a man to sit down in his own house. She didn't say anything else that night. The following week, an envelope arrived at Walt's door, no certified stamp, just his name in handwriting. Inside, Carol admitted she'd acted on assumptions she should have checked, and asked to speak with him, not as HOA president, but as a neighbor who'd gotten it wrong. Walt set the letter beside the photo of his wife. Before he could call her back, a knock came at the door. A young man stood there, dust on his boots, a folder under his arm. "Mr. Bracken, my name's Aaron Delacroix. Roy was my father." He paused. "I think we need to talk about the rest of that land." Inside, Aaron explained that when the bankruptcy estate got sold off, one parcel never made it in, land his father had held separately in trust to keep it from creditors. He slid a survey map across the table, showing the retention pond, the walking trail, and a strip behind the clubhouse. For 13 years, Aaron said, the HOA's been mowing it, building on it, without ever checking who held title. "Why bring this to me?" Walt asked. "Because I don't want it," Aaron said. "I watched my father chase land, his whole life, like it could fix something in him. I want to sell it to somebody who will do right by it." Walt studied the map a long while. "Give me a week, and don't tell that neighborhood a thing." He spent the week walking the creek line himself, matching survey markers to the ground. Everything checked out. By Friday, he called his lawyer, then Aaron, then Carol. "I think it's time we had a longer conversation," he said. "And I think the whole board ought to be there." They gathered at his kitchen table 2 days later. Walt laid out the map, the pond, the trail, near half an acre behind your clubhouse. None of it ever belonged to the association. Carol's face went pale. "How long have you known?" "A week." Frank leaned over the map. "This mean you're fixing to fence off the pond?" "No," Walt said. "It means I own it. What I do with it is still open." The treasurer, Douglas, asked about the new clubhouse meeting room built 4 years back. Walt nodded. "It sat on the parcel, too." "How much did we spend on all of it?" Carol asked quietly. "That," Walt said, "is a number you folks ought to find out for yourselves." The figure, once Douglas pulled 13 years of records, came to just over $91,000, spent maintaining land the association never legally owned. Carol came back to Walt's table alone, without her clipboard. "I don't know what to say, other than I'm sorry, not just for the police. I spent 6 years telling people I understood this neighborhood better than anyone. I didn't understand it at all. My wife used to say pride was the most expensive thing a person could own." Walt said, "You're paying that bill now. Question is what you do once it's paid. What do you want from us?" "Nothing dramatic. A fair lease on the pond and the trail. Same for the clubhouse land, reasonable terms, and I want that fining system looked at. Frank tells me a family nearly got sanctioned over a wheelchair ramp. That doesn't sit right with me. Bring it to the whole neighborhood," Walt added. "Let them decide who leads next, too. Trust doesn't come back just because a debt's paid. It comes back when people see the truth laid out plain and get a say in what happens after." The community meeting, 3 weeks later, filled the clubhouse, the very building whose ground now belonged to a quiet rancher most residents barely knew. Carol stood up front and told them everything: the survey, 13 years of unauthorized spending, the deed that had never included his land at all. There were angry questions, long silences. Frank reminded the room that trust, once spent carelessly, took time to rebuild, but rebuilding was possible. By night's end, a new lease had been drafted for the pond, the trail, and the clubhouse land. Terms fair enough that even the angriest residents nodded along. A board vote was set for the following month. Carol didn't campaign to keep her seat. A year later, a small wooden sign stood at the trailhead, "Trail maintained through agreement with W. Bracken," nothing more. Walt still never joined the association. Folks had stopped asking why. He kept Carol's letter, the one written before either of them knew how large the misunderstanding was, tucked in a cigar box beside his wife's photo. Some mornings, walking the creek line before sunrise, he'd pass neighbors out for their own walks, nodding to him the way people nod to someone they've learned, slowly, to trust. He never minded the quiet. He'd learned long ago the truth didn't need to be loud. It just needed to be true, and given enough time, it always found its way to daylight.